Hey everyone, and welcome to Outside the Walls. My name is John White.
I'm Casey McDonald.
I'm Steve Reeves.
And today the three of us want to discuss a subject that was submitted by one of our listeners, Mr. Devin Stewart. He submitted our first question and wanted us to talk a little bit today about the subject of persecution, especially as it has evolved over the years from this first century to now. So that's something that we're going to take some time to talk about today.
That's right. And, I think there's a lot of interest in this subject today because obviously we recognize we're living in a very different culture, and our culture has become increasingly secular here in the Western world. And not only have we gone from a condition in which many people were apathetic towards Christianity, but we've actually gone to a state where people are hostile towards Christianity and towards people of faith. We may not always recognize it in terms of physical persecution, but it is definitely there in terms of thought police, attitudes, the prevailing moral current, and these types of things. So I think we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And pardon me, I recently preached a sermon about 2 weeks ago as we've been going through the book of Acts. And I looked at Acts chapters 4 and 5 in the beginning of persecution within the early church. The scene there was after the healing of the lame man by Peter and John in Acts chapter 3, how the chief priests, the Sadducees, and the temple guards had arrested Peter and John and put them in prison. In fact, Acts chapter 4, verse 3 was the first time we find in the book of Acts persecution being directed towards the disciples. Certainly was not the last, but it was the first time we find them being imprisoned, holding them to the next day when they would be put on trial. Well, let me just ask you guys this question. What are some ways in which you think Christians today are suffering from persecution? Is this something that you believe is really an issue that is paramount in today's society?
Yeah, I definitely think that you mentioned, maybe different than what we see in the scriptures in some places of the world, but there are certainly some places in the world that are experiencing physical persecution where Christianity is frowned upon, where it's not accepted as one of the religions of the society. The government does not condone it, and because of that, it might not necessarily be a physical persecution, but they might put some sort of economic sanctions on Christians. It might cause issues in their workplace if they're not able to maybe advance. They might be ostracized relationally by their family or their friends.
Yeah.
So even if they're not taking out Christians and beating them, which certainly happens. I mean, we see those gruesome images on the news of Christians, being physically persecuted. But there's certainly other ways outside of physical persecution that it certainly goes on, and some of those even in our country.
Yes.
Yeah. I immediately thought, when you said family, I thought of Julie Broyles, our missionary in Cambodia, who, she runs a school there, and they work with a lot of young people. And the one thing that she said last time we got a missions update from her was a lot of these kids who are there that are learning, they're also learning from a scriptural standpoint, and they want to follow Christ. They want to become a disciple, but they know as soon as they do that, a lot of them, their families will just say, you don't exist to us anymore. You're
exactly
done. And that's, obviously that's a real big physical persecution because you're cut off from your family and from all of the support that brings.
Yes.
As far as in America today, I think the type of persecution that we face now is it's easy to understand if you ask the question, who have you talked to about Jesus lately? And you start to think about, if I'd even told some people I was a Christian, there's this feeling of like, well, that immediately says XYZ about me. That means
Correct.
I think this way or think that way. And you're immediately nervous about even telling people that, even though that's what the Great Commission is go and tell people about me. And, this prevailing sense of like, I don't want to say anything about that because people get upset immediately, whether they know me or not, or whatever they think about me is just, there's this default position about the faith.
Exactly. And, I think there's a real contrast here between where we find ourselves as Christians today and what we find in the lives of these early disciples who really did not hesitate to stand up for their faith, even in the midst of opposition. I mentioned here Peter and John in Acts chapter 4 as really the first persecution begins when they're placed in prison. They're taken before the Jewish council, and they are asked the question, in whose name have you performed this miracle? Going back to the healing of the lame man in the temple. And they said, in the name of Jesus. And they're commanded to not teach or to preach anymore in his name. They continue to do so, and then they're brought back, and they said, we told you not to do this. But I find it interesting, they make the statement, we cannot help but to teach and to preach about the things that we have heard.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that's where we find ourselves today, guys. Even though it is not a politically correct thing, and we live in this world of political correctness, whatever you want to interpret that to mean, but as Christians, there should be this conviction in our lives, I feel, to where, like the early disciples, we cannot help but to tell about what we have experienced in our lives. And maybe that's a part of the problem is that we, in our own lives, have not experienced the degree of transformation to where we cannot help but to talk to others about it, regardless of what the consequences might be. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, deciding beforehand the way that we're going to interact with somebody, I think is very important. And just thinking about if I am put in a certain situation where somebody is questioning my faith, trying to go through that, mentally, how am I going to respond? Because a lot of times, at least whenever I think about persecution, my mind goes to this, maybe persecution on a government level, where it's a government that is pressing down on Christians, but sometimes it's not. Maybe a lot of times it's not. I think about the physical kind of persecution in our country, and school shootings is something that comes to my mind. And, I think it was back in when the Columbine shooting happened.
Yes.
The question was asked by the shooter, are you a Christian? Do you believe in Jesus? And so from a physical standpoint, even in a country where we have the freedom of religion, that physical persecution to the point of death is still, out there in a reality and a possibility. And I think asking ourselves the question, if I am put in that situation where my faith is questioned and I, very literally have a gun pointed at my head, how am I going to respond? And trying to think about how you're going to react in that situation is very important. I mean, I think back to whenever I was a teenager, and thinking about how you're going to react whenever you're pushed with certain temptations, trying to put yourself mentally in that situation and turning that temptation away. And that exercise of mentally imagining yourself rejecting this is a very important thing. And I think the same goes with persecution. How are we going to react whenever our faith is questioned, whether that's through physical persecution or even economic, career-wise? How are we going to respond? And just trying to play that out in our heads, I think, is important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I have a question for you guys, because I mentioned this idea of like that feeling of, I don't want to say anything about this. And
Sure.
there's this natural, like on a cultural level, there's this thought process. Oh, you're a Christian, so that means this. And when I think about like the Columbine shooter or anybody that has this sort of hatred for churches, is there a point at which we have fallen away from what God has taught us, and there's a sense that maybe not us specifically, but the church at large deserves some of that, where we have done something wrong, or we have not been great representatives of Christ, as people tend to be people and, make mistakes. Is there a point where like some of that maybe is a little deserved? Some of the angry, I think about like the bullhorn guy on the side of the road with the sign that's yelling, turn or burn kind of thing. I don't wonder if that doesn't play into some of the cultural level thoughts about Christians from people outside of the church. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think we tend to be people who stereotype others and place them into categories, and then we try to place everybody within a certain category. And so the media has certainly portrayed Christians over the last, I would say over the last quarter of a century, if not maybe the last half a century. I think much of the media has portrayed Christianity as being this very, I'm not even sure the word I would use. I don't know if dogmatic is the word that I'm wanting to use or not, but this very in-your-face type of rabid, of fundamentalist type of thing that is very hostile. And that is not the face. That's not the face of Christ. That's not the face of Christians. Now, I recognize there have been some who have had that very militant attitude that has warranted that maybe to some degree, but the majority of people that I know who are Christians are individuals who are good folks seeking to live for the Lord to the best of their ability. They want to share their hope in Christ. They want to express love to others. They are not out to be militant. They are not out to be, well, Casey, I'm not expressing myself very well on this. But anyway, so John, in answer to your question, perhaps some of it has come about as a result of that.
It's that vocal minority, right? Like there's the small amount that make a bad face for all of us, even though, when Christ is speaking to his disciples in John 14, what does he say? Well, they will know who you are by your love for each other, the love that you have for each other. And that love characterizing what we believe and who we are, sometimes I feel like that gets drowned out. If there's a great persecution, to me, it's this cultural level persecution of not acknowledging that so much of the Christian faith is about loving each other, caring for each other, that so much of the foundations of early Christianity were caring for widows and orphans, caring for people who were very underserved and underloved within their culture. And now it feels like as soon as you say I'm a Christian, everybody envisions you on the street corner with the angry sign yelling at people, this sort of hateful vibe, right? And that's unfortunate that like this small minority kind of paints that picture on a cultural level for all of us. And
Well, as I think about this a little more thoroughly now, kind of run it through my mind, and I talk about the media, there is a scene that just popped into my mind that I think describes what we're talking about. Back in the 1970s, there was a very popular television show called The Waltons. Most of us have seen it in reruns. But there was one particular episode where in the small church there on Walton Mountain, they were having a revival meeting. And this evangelist was what was known as a hellfire brimstone type of evangelist. And he was just up there yelling at the top of his lungs, and he was even walking back in the aisle And in one particular scene, the father of the Waltons, who was not, certainly didn't profess any type of faith, he was visiting, and this evangelist just kind of got right in his face and was pretty much telling him, how it was. And it was portrayed in such a bombastic way that you couldn't help but to think of how overbearing this guy was. And so I think a lot of people have this idea that has come through the media through the years, is that Christians are wanting to force their faith down your throat type of thing. And obviously, there has been a pushback towards that to some degree.
Yeah. Whenever you ask the question, do we deserve it? I got to be honest with you, I cringed.
Why?
Well, because I think, do Christians deserve persecution? And I think, well, man, it's a tough pill to swallow, to recognize we deserve a lot worse than that. I mean, when Paul was writing to the Romans, he described that we're all sinners and we've all fallen short of the glory of God. The wages of our sin is death. And so as Christians, we don't deserve anything. Anything good that we have is because of God's grace. And so, in an answer to a question, do we deserve a lot of the persecution that's coming? To those families that have lost loved ones because of persecution, asking that question, that's just
it seems minor by comparison, right?
Yeah.
And it's just, we do deserve it because we're imperfect people and we live in a fallen world, and evil is out there. But it's because of God's grace that we have hope in something beyond that persecution. And so that's why it kind of hit me, because it's like, well, yeah, we do deserve it, but that's really hard to accept.
Maybe I didn't phrase that well.
No, I mean, you phrased it perfectly. I mean, it really made me.
I mean, that's a very pertinent question. We'll just stop and think for a moment. Jesus, in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, there, verses 8 through 11, I believe it is, says, blessed are those who are persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Great is your reward, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And then later Paul would write to Timothy that all who live godly in Christ will suffer persecution. In both of those cases, the statement was made when you suffer persecution, not if. This is not an either or proposition. And here in the book of Acts, we find this persecution that begins here in Acts chapters 4 and 5. But it certainly was not the end of the persecution, because you come over to Acts chapter 7 and you find the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. And then you come on in Acts chapter 8, and because of persecution in Jerusalem, the disciples were forced to flee into Samaria and into other regions. It was actually persecution that brought about the spread of the gospel throughout the ancient world. Acts chapter 12, verse 1, that James, the brother of John, was put to death by the sword. So persecution became a normal aspect of life for these early Christians, whereas for us today, we need to realize here in the United States particularly, the peace that we have enjoyed in our lifetime and going back over the last century or so has been very, very rare within the big picture of the Christian faith. We often forget that persecution was not something just in the first century, but those individuals throughout history who have sought to bring about reform, who have sought to spread the word in various ways, think about Martin Luther, or you think about John Wycliffe, who printed the first Bible. These individuals were tortured because they bucked the system.
Mm.
And when you and I go against the grain, whether it be of the culture or sometimes even our own traditions, persecution is a result of that.
Mm. And certainly I'm not trying to paint a picture that the Christian faith should become something that is an easy pill to swallow, because that's never been a characteristic of faith. It's always been, this is difficult to do. This is difficult to choose, right? The reward is great. The value is immense. It's the greatest gift of all mankind, but it's never been an easy pill to swallow, to choose to follow Christ. And so I'm not trying to paint the picture that
Sure.
that on a cultural level we should make this into something that can just be easily swallowed, because it never ever will be. And maybe that's part of our persecution. But what's interesting about discussing persecution over the years is persecution actually causes the Christian faith to thrive. That's what's so interesting to me, is that it's a given. It's the Bible by default says you're going to face the same thing that everybody else faces, right? Persecution is a given. And yet, by default, almost, anytime you see persecution throughout history or in different cultures in different ways, the Christian faith only tends to grow despite that persecution.
Yeah, which makes me ask the question, why do you suppose that it's sometime avoided?
Mm.
If we know that on an intellectual basis, anything that would cause suffering, would cause persecution, my instincts is to avoid that.
Sure.
And so if Christianity as a whole, the scriptures tell us to expect persecution. We know that persecution can bring about the spread of the gospel. And so why do you think we're still resistant to it?
Well, I think, as you say, none of us likes the idea of suffering. None of us likes the idea of physical pain or inconvenience or whatever it might be. We don't like the idea of being denied a privilege or a right, what we might consider to be a right. We certainly don't like the idea of our families being persecuted in whatever way it might occur. So we naturally, I think, as a tendency of the flesh, want to avoid those situations. But, going back to something you said, John, about those times of persecution being when the church has actually been strengthened, I think one of the reasons for that is because persecution really separates those who are serious about their faith in Jesus Christ from those for whom Christianity is merely a social type of commitment. It's more of a convenience type of thing. It's more what everybody else is doing, more of a status thing, or more of just a traditional thing. Well, my parents did this, I'm doing this. Mm-hmm. But when persecution occurs that really makes you have to choose, are you going to go the route of resistance? Are you going to go against the grain of culture because of what you believe? That is the person who spiritually is going to grow in their faith. And I think that's why during times of persecution, it's almost like pouring gas on a flame. It spreads. That's what happened there in the book of Acts. What was intended to douse the flame of Christianity actually ended up spreading the flame of Christianity.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me about that, so the earliest persecutions, I think about this concept of light. I think when you face evil and injustice and you see it in the world, your immediate reaction as people is to look for something that provides light, that provides hope. And that is where the Christian message of Jesus Christ and the sacrifice for our sins and this hope of salvation, it becomes even more apparent in the face of persecution.
Yes.
It's almost like the light shines brightest in the darkness. So when we faced throughout the centuries real intense, physical persecution on a government level, I think it thrives because everyone says, this is injustice. What we're seeing and what's happening to us is very unfair. And that only makes the hope of Jesus even more bright. It's much brighter, and when we're able to see and experience that on a normal level. Whereas right now, we're free to worship and do as we wish. The only real persecution being a more of a cultural, social one. But if all of your friends are Christians, then you don't really experience that. Or if you have a really good workplace, and you don't really have to worry about that. So the only one is a social one. And maybe that's where some of the struggle comes in, because it's like, well, everything's good. And maybe that means that the hope of salvation doesn't shine quite as bright to us because we don't have anything to compare it against. We don't have any great evil to compare it against that we face on a daily basis. We can see the great evils in the world. We can see war. We can see persecution of Christians in other countries, but we don't experience it firsthand. And so therefore, the sense of the value of hope of salvation is sort of diminished because of that, because it's something we can just openly accept and be okay with.
Yeah. And I think this as we think about persecution and, maybe in a society where there's not that physical persecution, but maybe the societal ostracization, you think about our kids that are in public schools. Mm-hmm. If you're an individual that is working in a secular job where you're around people who are not Christians, and whether that means you're not going to get, the promotions or the pay raises because of, maybe your beliefs. And so there's that type of persecution. In a way, it brings us closer to the church because we think, well, I don't fit in those situations because I am a Christian. But whenever I go to church, whenever I'm amongst God's people, whenever I get to go to my Bible study, those are people that are like me, and we find some comfort, and I think it really draws the church closer together. And so whenever we think about persecution, I think a lot of times we try to avoid it because it causes discomfort. Nobody wants to be inconvenienced, but at the same time, that persecution is also what drives us together as Christians. Something that you had mentioned, Steve, whenever Jesus was preaching his Sermon on the Mount, and he was talking about blessed are those who are persecuted.
Yes.
I think about prophets past that were persecuted, and I think about Daniel. Very much from a government standpoint, he was persecuted, being thrown into the lion's den, his friends being thrown into the fiery furnace. And I think about those prophets like Jeremiah, like Elijah, who were persecuted because of their beliefs, and in some of those cases they were persecuted by their own people. And then I think about in the time of right after Jesus, when the apostles were preaching, this verse has always stuck out to me whenever I think about persecution, at least in the first century. In Acts chapter 5 and verse 41, they had been arrested, they had been beaten, and told not to continue preaching Jesus. And so they left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. And so they actually counted themselves worthy in order to suffer this persecution. And that's just always blown my mind, that mindset that, whenever you experience persecution in whatever form it might take, if we can change our mindset into, I'm worthy to suffer on behalf of Christ.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
It's like now I'm it's like a rite of passage. Now
that's exactly
I finally face some persecution. And so that must be the stamp of approval because, that's what Jesus says. A student is not greater than his master, right?
Yeah.
If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And so it's like, well, you're in good company now.
Right.
You're with Jesus. Like Jesus was persecuted. Yeah. If you are, then great. That's amazing. I love that.
Well, and that's kind of the idea that Peter uses when he writes his letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. he was writing to Christians who had been scattered throughout the region, again, because of persecution. And I love the illustration he uses in 1 Peter 1 when he talks about faith being refined. As gold is refined by fire. You think about the refining process by which gold is melted down so the impurities might rise to the top and be skimmed off, and then it is cooled, and then it's heated again, and each time it goes through the fire, impurities rise to the surface, and the goldsmith will then take them off, skim them off, until finally he can look into that vat of gold and he can see his own reflection. And I think this is the purifying effect of persecution upon the church. It does skim off the impurities. It causes our faith to be strengthened until we come to resemble Christ. Going back to Acts chapter 4, verse 13, notice what it says about these disciples, about Peter and John. It says that as the council looked at them and recognized that they were uneducated and untrained men, they took note of them as having been with Jesus. And it's during those times of trial in our lives that I think people will really take note of us as having been with Jesus.
And to me, that's the key to the survival. I was thinking about that same exact verse, Steve. So that's funny you brought that up, because I was, asking the question, like, we're facing persecution all over the world. How do we endure through that? How do we make it through and still see the gospel spread? And you just brought up the key right there, being with Jesus. The difference is what people see in us has to be this difference of Jesus in our lives, this existence of Jesus in our lives, and the Spirit, and trying to follow and be what it is that Christ called us to is the key to survival in persecution in the face of it, So if we're going to move through that, if we're going to be able to see the gospel grow, not just survive, but to see the gospel grow, to see the church grow, we've got to be with Jesus. We've got to spend time with Jesus. That's got to be at the core of what we do and believe and think in every part of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Whenever I think about, prayers in our public assembly, one of the things that we often pray and thank God for is being able to assemble without fear of persecution. And though I am thankful for that, I also question, is that really something that we should be thankful for, especially given the overwhelming number of scriptures that talk about how we're to expect persecution, and if we're living a life that Christ calls us to live, that we will experience persecution. And so, though I am thankful that we don't have that, it almost makes me wonder this idea of, well, if we're not experiencing persecution, are we doing something wrong?
Have we gotten too comfortable?
Yeah.
It's interesting you bring that idea up. Have either of you read the book Radical by David Platt? It's been out for several years ago. David Platt is a preacher in the Birmingham area. He's a former teacher, I believe, at New Orleans Theological Seminary. But he tells just a fascinating story about going to Southeast Asia, to a country where Christianity is outlawed. And he went to a church gathering, a meeting, and people were having to come in wearing dark. It was at night, and they had to come in wearing dark clothing and hoods over their heads so they would not be recognized. And when they came into this room, it was a very primitive building, concrete block building, concrete floor. There were no chairs. People had to stand around, and they stood in a circle. They had whatever windows were covered so no one could see inside what they were having to do. And they began praying for some of their members who were in prison. And this wasn't just a prayer for a minute or two. They prayed for over an hour. And David said that at one point he looked down and there was a pool of water in the middle of the floor. And it was tears that were rolling down the cheeks of these believers, these Christians, as they were praying for their brethren who were in prison. And David then talked about that with coming back to the United States, to the church where he speaks there in the Birmingham area, a mega church with theater seats and air conditioning and stage lighting and all of the trappings that we see in modern American church going. And he thought to himself, we have missed this. We have missed what this is all about. And I just can't help but to agree with that. I think we have surrounded ourselves with so many cultural comforts that we have forgotten that Christianity is not about our convenience. It's not. It's not about what makes us feel good. It is about servanthood. It's about dedication and all of these things. It's about taking up our cross and following Jesus, Matthew 16:24. And when we do those things, it is not going to be palatable with society.
Yeah, the idea of comfort, I think that's one that we should be very wary of. Have we gotten too comfortable? That question. And I think that's something that we need to be asking on the sort of macro level with all of our churches and on a personal level too.
Yes.
Asking, am I too comfortable? Is that why I won't talk to that coworker that I know may be interested in Christ, or that I've wanted to say something to? Is that why I won't talk to the friend, the student, the whatever it is about Christ? Because I know that that's going to cause some discomfort, that maybe they decide, well, I don't want to be your friend, or I don't want to be around you anymore. Or it gets weird because now you've brought this elephant into the room, and it's like, are we too comfortable in our everyday lives that we're not willing to face a little bit of that?
Yes.
and know that that's exactly what we should be feeling and experiencing, because that's the message of the gospel. It's beautiful and amazing, but it can bring a little discomfort. It can bring a lot of discomfort to the lives of people who have a lot of things to turn away from and move through, and certainly we all do.
Well, there in Acts 5, verse 29, we find this statement when all of this persecution that is going on with these early disciples, particularly Peter and John, kind of comes to a head, and they are confronted by the Jewish council about, we've warned you, we've told you now. And then Peter makes this statement, we must obey God rather than men. I'm like Amos. Amos said, I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet. Okay. So I'm not a prophet. I'm not a son of a prophet. But I do believe in our culture, in our country, here in the United States, I don't see the situation getting better. I don't mean that from a pessimistic standpoint, but I believe we are entering into a time when Christians are going to find our faith challenged to a greater extent, socially, economically, and in terms of just basic human rights than we have ever experienced before. Mm-hmm. And I believe the freedoms that we have experienced from a religious perspective. You mentioned this, Casey, the person that prays, thank you for the ability to come together like this. I don't know how long we're going to have that. I mean, there is legislation on the books in some places throughout our country where if you say certain things that are directed towards certain behaviors, that is automatically labeled as hate speech. Mm-hmm. And churches can lose tax-exempt status and things such as this. So I think there is a real possibility that our children, our grandchildren, are going to be faced with a very different culture in terms of freedom that we've had and that we've taken for granted.
Mm. And the beauty of that is that they will be in good company.
Absolutely.
They will be among many brethren over the thousands of years that our faith has been in existence who have faced this and even worse. And so maybe we need to take the approach of the Christians in Acts 5 that say, man, I'm thankful that we've been counted among those worthy of being persecuted.
Exactly.
You know?
And, as I think about that, there's a part of my mind that thinks, I'm not so sure, but that's maybe a good thing, because I do believe it will refine our faith and it will get us back to what is truly important about the gospel and about our lives, rather than some of the fluff that is currently and has been passed off as Christianity.
And refining our faith. That we've talked a little bit about the prophets in the first century and persecution now. Looking back just a few centuries after Christ, whenever Constantine legalized Christianity, there was this influx of people coming into the church because all of a sudden Christianity was accepted by the emperor, and there was there was tax benefits for Christianity, and there was all these people coming to Christianity because all of a sudden it was nothing to worry about kind of thing. And so now as we think about the possibility of kind of the reverse of that happening, and maybe in a society where that's becoming less and less acceptable, how do we overcome the fear that of persecution? In other words, there was an influx of Christianity, and so if that is turned around and there's actually government persecution of Christianity, and naturally I would assume that there's going to be a rush of people getting out of Christianity. And so how do we prepare people for that possibility? How do we prepare people to overcome that fear? Because as you look throughout scriptures, fear blinds us from God, and fear certainly turns us away and causes us to forget God. And so how do we get our people beyond that fear and teach them to overcome?
Yeah.
Well, I think, Casey, the words of an old song that begins, "This world is not my home." I think a lot of us today have forgotten that this life here on earth is temporary. God has something so much better for us than what is here and now. But we put down so many roots here and now in this life, and we feel so threatened when there's the possibility that those things can be taken from us. But the early disciples, they had this realization that waiting for them was something that was so much better. Read the book of Revelation, and you find those who were martyred for their faith and how they were given this special place of honor because they had resisted to the point of death. And in fact, that's what Jesus told the early church, the 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3, be faithful to death, and I'll give you the crown of life. So we need to remember that there's a lot more to life than just this world. And this world isn't home. And if I lose my life physically because I am taking a stand for Christ, let me tell you what, it's just graduation to glory, fellas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my response to that question is, as darkness grows, the need to remember the light becomes even greater.
Exactly.
I think focusing on the actual hope of salvation, the core to the whole story, to our whole faith, is also the answer to facing persecution. Whatever the days lie ahead, I know that we can face them because we have hope in Jesus. And
Precisely.
I think as Christians, if we're facing more and more persecution, as that grows, we've got to continue and increase our focus on hope of salvation and the hope of Jesus Christ and just focusing on the light. And if we continue to walk in that light and draw from that, no matter how great the darkness gets, it will not overcome the light.
Precisely.
Well, guys, I think that's a good place to kind of draw this to a close. We appreciate everyone for joining us today for Outside the Walls. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts you want to share with us, send those over to questions@wschurch.net. But for now, we're thankful that you've joined us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.